Hello, Taurus. Welcome back. Today, maybe we can slow things down for a moment and just walk through this story together. There are reunions that don't come with a warning, no long message, no words about how much someone has been thinking about you, just a name quietly returning to your mind, or appearing on your phone screen, almost by accident, in the middle of a day that felt completely ordinary. And the strange part is, you don't flinch. You don't rush. There's only a very subtle feeling, like walking past an old street you once knew so well you never needed to read the signs. Taurus tends to feel these things deeply. Not through immediate thoughts, but through something a little deeper. Maybe it's the way your heartbeat slows down, or a soft pause that appears before you can even name what you're feeling. It's not exactly longing. Not quite happiness either. It feels more like picking up an old jacket again. It still fits. It still feels familiar in your hands. But you're not the same person who used to wear it. And then, as things begin to settle just a little, you start to notice something you may not have considered before. It's not that they've changed. It's not that the situation is completely different. It's you. You don't react as quickly as you once did. You don't rush to label everything as right or wrong. You don't feel that urge to fix something immediately, or to explain everything before it slips away. Instead, you observe. You look back at the way you once left, the way you once stayed silent, the way you once believed that walking away from someone meant the story was completely over. But now, as that name returns, it doesn't feel that simple anymore. It doesn't feel like a new beginning. But it doesn't feel entirely like the past either. It's more like standing in the middle of a circle, a place you've already walked through. But this time, you're standing in a different position. There's a very quiet moment when you realize you're no longer the same person who once walked away from that relationship. You've lived through your own private days. Moments no one else saw. Times you sat with yourself, even when it wasn't easy. And all of that doesn't disappear just because a name has returned. That's why this idea of going back feels harder to define. It doesn't feel like walking backward. It feels more like stepping into a familiar room again, but the light inside has changed. The window is still there. The table hasn't moved, but the way the light falls across the room is no longer the same, and you stand there in a very quiet moment, not rushing to decide, not rushing to label what this is, just noticing you've changed. And maybe that change is exactly what makes this reunion feel different. Not like a repetition, but like something else entirely. Something lighter, slower, and just a little harder to hold on to. There's a thought that keeps returning. Very small, but persistent. I've come this far, so why does it feel like I'm going back here again? It doesn't arrive like a storm. It feels more like water dripping in a quiet kitchen late at night. One drop at a time. Slow, steady. And the quieter everything becomes, the clearer you hear it. For Taurus, growth often takes the shape of stability. A life that feels more ordered. A heart that isn't pulled in every direction. A way of loving that carries less reaction, less resistance, less fear of being left behind. So when someone from the past returns, something inside you pauses. Not because the feeling is gone, but because it took you a long time to step away from that feeling in the first place. You remember the nights you told yourself to stay strong. The times you walked past familiar places, pretending nothing was there. The songs you had to skip too quickly because one line alone could bring an entire season back. And now, as that door opens again, you're not only seeing them. You're seeing the version of yourself who once stood inside that story. The one who loved with patience, who waited longer than anyone knew, who stayed quiet too often, who tried to appear okay while something inside was quietly cracking. So the guilt makes sense, not because you did something wrong, but because it feels like you might be betraying the path you fought so hard to walk. You wonder if those days of healing somehow lose their meaning. If the lessons you thought you learned were never really finished. If someone on the outside might look in and say that Taurus has returned to the very place that once caused pain. But beneath all those voices, there's something softer. Something quieter. Going back doesn't always mean moving backward. Sometimes, people return to a familiar place not because they couldn't leave, but because this time they're no longer standing there with shaking hands. You're not the person who needed immediate answers just to feel loved. Not the one who tried to hold everything together just to avoid losing what felt familiar. Not the one who swallowed every emotion and called it peace. This time, you can look at that familiarity with a slower gaze. You can feel the memory without letting it carry you away. You can hear familiar words without rushing to believe them or to reject them. And that's where the confusion comes in. Because if you were still as fragile as before, this would be easier to name. You could say you miss them, that you never moved on, that your heart is still caught in the same place. But this doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like weakness. It feels like a pause that you chose. Like standing at a familiar road, but no longer running into it with your eyes closed. You look more closely now. You move more slowly. You ask yourself questions you didn't ask before. And maybe that's a quiet kind of growth that belongs to Taurus. Not loud. Not something that needs to be seen. Just a shift where the past no longer controls you the same way. You can turn and look back without losing your direction. You can feel something again without losing your clarity. You can admit that a part of you still softens when you think of them, without calling that a failure. Because sometimes, growth isn't about no longer feeling anything for what once mattered. Sometimes it's simply being able to sit with that feeling a little longer, without running from it, without turning it into a decision too quickly. And in that slower space, something small begins to take shape. Maybe what you're afraid of isn't going back to someone from your past. Maybe it's realizing that you still have the capacity to love something that once hurt you. But this time, with a steadier heart, when you return to a past relationship, the first thing you notice is not what has changed. It's what is still there, quietly resting, as if it never really left. The pauses that were never named. The sentences that once stopped halfway, with no one picking them up again. The passing glances that both of you understand, but neither of you speaks about. There's a very particular kind of silence when two people who once knew each other sit side by side again. It isn't uncomfortable like a first meeting. And it isn't light like the space between strangers. It feels more like stepping into an old house. The familiar scent still lingers in the air, but everything is covered in a thin layer of time. And what surprises you most is that this time, you don't rush to wipe that layer away. Before, you might have tried to fill the space quickly, saying more than necessary, explaining things that were never even asked, or pushing the conversation forward just to avoid that in-between feeling. But now you stay with it. You hear the soft shift of a chair when someone adjusts their posture. You notice the pause between sentences where no words step in. And you hear yourself not rushing the way you used to. It's not because you stopped caring. And it's not because you've grown distant. It's simply that you're beginning to understand some things lose their meaning when you try to fix them too quickly. Like a crack in an old wall. You could cover it easily. But if you stand there a little longer, you start to see that the crack holds a story. A story about time. About pressure. About quiet endurance no one ever saw. The silence between two people can feel the same. It's no longer a distance you need to overcome. It becomes more like a still lake. And this time, you don't rush to throw a stone just to make ripples. You simply watch. You notice how the light touches the surface. You notice the reflections, not perfectly clear, but enough to recognize. And in that moment, you're not only seeing the person across from you, you're seeing yourself from another time. A version of you who once feared silence. Who believed that if nothing was said, something must be slipping away. Who tried to keep the conversation alive, even when something inside was already growing tired. But now, you don't have to do that anymore. You can sit still without feeling like you're losing something. You can let things move more slowly without feeling uneasy. There are moments when you notice you're no longer searching for a clear answer from them. Not because you don't want to understand, but because you no longer need that answer to feel whole. And that changes the way you show up in this moment. You're no longer sitting there to fix a relationship. You're simply there to feel it. To notice that something familiar is still in the air, but it no longer rests heavily on your shoulders. To notice how a simple sentence no longer pulls you into overthinking. How a glance doesn't spiral into assumptions. Everything feels lighter. Not because it means less, but because you're no longer holding it so tightly. And in that lightness, something quiet begins to unfold. Sometimes, what changes is not the story between two people. It's the way you step into that story. You're no longer arriving from a place of needing to be filled. You arrive as someone who is already a little more whole. And it's that quiet sense of fullness that makes the silence feel different. It becomes a place where you can pause, breathe a little slower, and notice that some connections don't need many words to remain. They can still exist in a way that feels very still and very calm, and in that stillness, something else begins to surface. Slowly, but clearly. You look at the person across from you, and there's a moment that feels unfamiliar. Not the kind where you feel like you understand them better, but something quieter. You begin to recognize yourself somewhere in the way they respond. The familiar patterns are still there. The way they hesitate when something important comes up. The way they avoid questions that don't have easy answers. The way they hold back a part of what they feel, as if saying it out loud might take things too far. It all feels familiar. So familiar you can almost anticipate the rhythm of what comes next. But this time, the feeling is different. Before, you might have felt frustrated, or hurt, or the need to change it somehow. Now you simply notice. You notice without reacting. You notice without trying to fix anything. And in a very quiet moment, something shifts. It's not just them who has been this way. You have been too. There were times you stayed silent when you needed to speak. Times you held things back because you were afraid that saying them might change everything. Times you tried to manage someone else's emotions just to keep things feeling safe. Old versions of you are sitting somewhere inside this conversation. And what's different now is that you don't turn away. You don't deny it. You don't feel ashamed. You don't try to separate yourself from that version of you as if it never existed. You just look the way you might open an old journal and read something you once wrote in a moment that was completely real. Maybe a little clumsy. Maybe a little emotional. But not wrong. Just not fully understood at the time. There's a softness in the way you see your past now. Less sharp than before. Less judgment. You don't blame yourself for believing, for waiting, for staying longer than you should have. You begin to see that everything back then unfolded in the only way you knew how. And maybe the other person was doing the same. They were carrying parts of themselves that weren't fully formed. Things they didn't understand yet. Ways of trying that were imperfect, but still real. So when the two of you sit together now, it's not just who you are today facing each other. There are older versions quietly present in the background. Not interrupting. Not demanding attention. Just there as part of a story that never completely disappeared. For the first time, you don't feel trapped between the past and the present. You don't try to force everything into one side or the other. You stand somewhere in the middle, and you allow both to exist. The older version with what was unfinished. The present version with a little more understanding. And in that space, there's a feeling that's hard to name. It isn't complete forgiveness. It isn't forgetting. It feels more like a quiet kind of acceptance. That everything that happened played a part in shaping who you are now. And maybe the most surprising part is that you no longer feel the need to avoid your past. You can look at it directly. Sit beside it. Even in some quiet way, be in conversation with it. There's no urgency to change anything. No need to reach a final conclusion. You're simply no longer afraid of looking back. And in that way of seeing, something small becomes clearer. Maybe growth isn't about getting as far away as possible from what once hurt you. Maybe it's being able to return, to look at it, and not lose yourself in the process. There are changes that no one sees right away. There isn't a clear moment you can point to and say, "This is when I became different." It doesn't arrive through something big. There's no specific day to mark. No applause. No one standing on the outside to confirm it. It lives in the smallest details, so small that if you're not paying close attention, you might miss them. You find yourself in a conversation and notice you no longer need to win. You don't feel the urge to finish every point just to prove you're right. Some sentences stop halfway, and this time you let them. Not because you stopped caring, but because you're beginning to understand not everything needs a conclusion. There are moments when you realize you're listening more. Not listening to respond, but listening to understand. And sometimes just to feel what's there. You hear the spaces between the words, the things left unsaid, and you no longer try to pull them into the light at any cost. There's a quiet kind of patience in the way you stay now. No rushing. No forcing. No adjusting someone else's rhythm just to match your own. It feels like sitting by a window on a slow afternoon, watching sunlight move gently across the floor. You can't make it move faster. You can't hold it in place. You can only sit there and notice it. The way you love starts to feel like that. You don't hold on as tightly. You don't check every small sign to reassure yourself that everything is okay. You don't feel the need to keep doing something just to keep the connection from drifting. There's space now, and you're no longer afraid of it. The clearest shift may be in the fear of losing. There was a time when the thought of someone leaving could shake your balance. You would try to hold on, to fix, to make everything feel stable again. But now, you still care. You still feel the connection, it's just that you don't place your entire sense of peace inside it anymore. Not because you love less. Not because you've grown cold. But because you've learned how to stand on your own, even when things around you feel uncertain. You can stay without clinging. You can open your heart without trading away your inner steadiness. And this didn't come from one big decision. It came from many small moments you lived through on your own. The times you chose silence instead of reacting right away. The times you reassured yourself without needing someone else to do it. The evenings you sat alone with your feelings, not avoiding them, not rushing to fill the space. All of it adds up. Quietly. Slowly. Like a tree growing without making a sound. Maybe the other person doesn't notice these changes yet. They still see you through old memories. Still recognize the version of you they once knew. But you know. You know how you respond differently now. You know what you no longer do. You know the boundaries you've begun to hold that didn't exist before. And sometimes, that's enough. No need to prove it. No need to explain. No need for it to be recognized. Just noticing the shift within yourself can already be enough. Enough to sit inside an old story, without feeling like you've returned to the beginning. Enough to keep moving forward, whatever direction that may be, with a steadier ground beneath you. And a heart that feels a little more at ease, and from that quiet, a new way of seeing begins to open. Not all at once. Not like an answer placed clearly in front of you. It comes slowly, like pulling the curtains back in the morning, little by little, until a familiar room appears in a different kind of light. You start to wonder, am I really going back to the past? Or am I stepping into a place I once knew, but this time with steadier feet, a deeper breath, and a heart that no longer feels afraid? There are paths in life that feel strange like this. You think you've already walked them. You think you've closed them. You think if you stop mentioning them, they'll stay quietly behind you. And then one day, life brings you back to that same turning point. Not to turn you into who you used to be, but maybe to see if you've learned how to walk through it differently. For Taurus, this can feel even more sensitive. Because you don't easily dismiss what once mattered. Someone who once lived in your heart, doesn't simply become an ordinary name. Even if you've moved forward, even if you've grown stronger, even if you've learned how to feel steady in the days without them, there may still be a small place inside that remembers. Not in a way that pulls you back, but the way an old house still holds the scent of wood after years of being closed. And when you stand in front of that house again, you don't have to move back in. You don't have to tear it down just to prove that you've grown. Maybe all you need to do is open the door, stand there for a moment, look around, and notice what feels different within you. Some unfinished things don't need to be made perfect. They just need to be seen again with a calmer heart. A question that was never answered. An apology that came too late. A feeling that was buried because neither of you was ready to face it at the time. None of it needs to turn into a perfect ending. But it can become a moment of understanding. And sometimes, that understanding alone can make things feel lighter. You no longer see the circle as something that traps you. You don't feel like you're losing your way by returning to something familiar. It begins to feel more like a spiral. From a distance, it looks like the same place. But in truth, you're standing on a different level. The same person, the same memory, the same kind of familiar feeling. But you're no longer the version of yourself who stood there holding fear. You can hear an old story again without feeling the same pain. You can meet a familiar gaze without losing your breath. You can admit that something inside you still softens, without seeing that as weakness. And maybe this is one of the most subtle lessons for Taurus. Not everything that returns means you are stuck. Not every familiar place is meant to make you smaller. Some places only feel dangerous when you enter them with the same old wounds. But when you walk in with awareness, with self-respect, with the ability to listen to yourself, that place can become a mirror. It shows you what you've moved through, what still needs a gentler touch, and what you can choose without giving up your peace. Taurus understands the value of time. You're not someone who forgets easily just because you're told to. You're not someone who lets go quickly of something that once grew deep roots inside you. And because of that, when you return to something familiar, it doesn't have to mean weakness. It can be a very quiet kind of courage. The courage to not pretend the past never mattered. The courage to not turn old pain into a wall that stays forever. The courage to move slowly and still keep yourself in your own hands. You don't have to decide too quickly whether this is right or wrong. Maybe today, it's enough to allow yourself to see it differently. Not as a circle pulling you back to the beginning, but as a familiar path gently asking you, this time, can you walk through it and still remain yourself? Maybe that question doesn't need an answer right away. It feels more like something you carry quietly inside as you step back into a familiar space. And then, something else begins to reveal itself. Not all at once, but clearly enough. The hardest part is not going back. It's how you choose to stay. Staying without returning to the version of yourself you used to be. Staying without making yourself smaller, just to keep everything calm. Staying without trading away the sense of peace that took you so long to rebuild. Old patterns may try to return. The way you once stayed silent to avoid a conflict. The way you swallowed things that needed to be said. The way you told yourself it was fine even when it wasn't. Those patterns don't disappear completely. They're like old trails in a forest. If you drift just a little, you can find yourself walking the same path again. But this time, there's a small pause before each reaction. You notice when you're about to go quiet, and you stop. Not to force yourself to say more. Just to ask, does this still feel true to who I am now? There are things you begin to say out loud, not with a defensive tone, not to prove anything, just because you no longer want to carry them alone. Simple words. But for you, they don't feel simple anymore. It's like opening a window after it's been closed for a long time. The air doesn't rush in all at once. But you can tell something has begun to shift. You also start to understand your boundaries more clearly. Not the kind that push people away, but something quieter. a space you keep for yourself so you can breathe. You're no longer trying to blend completely into someone else. You don't see agreement as the only way to keep things peaceful. There are moments when you choose not to say more. Moments when you choose not to continue a conversation. Not because you're giving up, but because you sense you don't need to go any further. And in that clarity, something real takes place. You begin to accept that the other person may still be who they are. They may not have changed in the way you once hoped. They may still carry the same habits, the same patterns, the same parts that aren't ready yet. And this time, you don't try to fix it. Not because you don't care, but because you no longer believe it's your role to change someone else just to make things feel right. You don't carry the weight anymore of making the relationship work at any cost. You carry yourself. With clarity. With your own rhythm. With a way of loving that no longer asks you to give up so much. There's a quiet lightness that comes with that. You don't need to hold on tightly. You don't need to leave quickly either. You simply stay when it still feels aligned with who you are now. Like sitting in a room. If the air feels easy, you stay a little longer. If it begins to feel heavy, you open the door or step outside. No need for long explanations. No need to make it dramatic. You listen to yourself and you honor that feeling. And maybe this is a very quiet kind of growth. It's not that you never return to familiar places. It's that those places no longer decide who you become. You can stay and still keep your own breath. You can open your heart without losing your inner steadiness. And in the way you show up now, there's less effort to be right for someone else. It feels more like you're learning how to be true to yourself. Just a little more each time. And within that quiet truth, something gentle begins to take shape. There's a subtle difference between going back and choosing again. Going back can feel like being pulled by memory, by habit, by the parts of you that haven't fully let go. It can happen quickly, almost without awareness, like walking a familiar road without thinking. Choosing again feels much quieter. It doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need long explanations. It doesn't need anyone outside of you to say whether it's right or wrong. It's a private moment where you realize you're here, in the present, and you still have a choice. Not a choice shaped by fear of losing. Not a choice made just because something feels familiar. But a choice that comes from noticing that after everything you've lived through, something here still holds meaning. And if something begins to form again, it doesn't feel the way it once did. It isn't rushed. It doesn't carry the same weight of expectation. It doesn't feel like something you have to hold on to at any cost. It feels more like two people sitting together in a familiar space, each carrying their own quiet stillness. Not trying to become a better version in each other's eyes. Just being a little more honest with themselves. There may still be things that aren't clear. There may still be spaces that haven't been filled. But you don't feel the need to rush anymore. Some things, when allowed to move slowly, begin to take shape on their own. And maybe the biggest shift is not about where this connection might lead. It's in the way you step into it. With a different rhythm. One that isn't hurried. One that isn't carried away by passing emotion. One that holds enough space for you to hear yourself more clearly. Sometimes, growth is not about going as far away as possible from what once mattered. It's about being able to return, to stand there, and not lose yourself. And if you find yourself in a moment like this, something that feels both familiar and unfamiliar, what part of yourself do you feel drawn to listen to a little more closely? The answer doesn't need to be clear right now. If you can stay with your feelings without rushing away, that might already say more than you realize. And if stories like this touch something quiet inside you, you can stay here a little longer. There's always more we can move through together, at a slower pace like this. And for now, this story comes to a close, but the feeling it leaves behind may stay with you, like a soft, quiet space within your own heart.